Hello, I'm Smith Nikeklarr Ahlaenovik, the Cartographer of Consciousness and founder of the Nikeklarr Institute. In this piece, I want to introduce three conceptual terms I have been developing through observation, lived experience, discernment, and pattern recognition. These terms are spasmosis, toxic transverse gender polarity disorder, or TTGPD, and transverse toxic orgasmic rage disorder, or TTORD. Before I go any further, I want to be very clear. These are not formal psychiatric, psychological, or medical diagnoses. They are not terms taken from the DSM-ICD or any established clinical framework that I am aware of. They are conceptual and descriptive terms that I have created, because I kept seeing patterns in human behaviour that ordinary language did not seem to name precisely enough. So this is my attempt to fill a gap, not to replace psychology, but to describe what I believe psychology and ordinary language often miss in the lived relational, behavioural, and energetic pattern. Let's begin with spasmosis, because that is the wider umbrella. Spasmosis is my term for reactive dysregulation that overtakes discernment. It is the point where a person is no longer fully present, grounded, self-governing, or relationally clear, but is instead being run by a charged pattern. They may still be speaking, arguing, reacting, preaching, defending, collapsing, or pushing, but the reaction is now driving them more than conscious awareness is. Simple explanation: spasmosis is when the reaction is running the person. It can show up as emotional flooding, rigid defensiveness, sudden righteousness, overreaction, narrowing of perception, fixation on one detail, inability to hear the wider point, or a kind of altered state where the person is no longer truly in clean contact with themselves or the other person. In my framework, spasmosis is what happens when discernment drops and a charged pattern takes over. Now, inside that wider principle, I began noticing another pattern. This had to do with masculine and feminine polarity, not in the shallow sense of stereotype, but in the deeper sense of inner balance, inner orientation, and authentic embodiment. That is where the term TTGPD came from. TTGPD stands for Toxic Transversed Gender Polarity Disorder. Again, I use the word disorder here in a descriptive and conceptual sense, not as a formal diagnosis. The pattern I was trying to describe was this: some people seem deeply disconnected from the true inner meaning of masculine and feminine qualities, and instead perform, exaggerate, invert, harden, or mask them through identity, power, control, external validation, and relational behaviour. Simple explanation: T, T, G, P, D is when masculine and feminine polarity become distorted, performative, and disconnected from truth. End of part 1. Part 2. This is not about sexuality. It is not simply about whether someone is male or female. It is not about healthy masculinity or healthy femininity. It is about confusion, inversion, toxic over-identification, or disconnection from the deeper principles these polarities are meant to carry. In this state, someone may perform hardness instead of healthy strength. They may perform softness instead of healthy receptivity. They may mistake control for leadership, manipulation for care, dominance for masculinity, chaos for feminine depth, or emotional collapse for intimacy. In relationships, this can show up as rigid role assignment, exaggerated dominance or submission, obsession with who provides and who obeys, who performs strength and who performs vulnerability, all without authentic integration. For me, that was the gap. I could see the pattern, but the available language felt too blunt, too moral, or too superficial to map what was actually happening. TTGPD became a way to name the distortion more precisely. From there, I noticed something even more charged. In some people, especially where shame, power, sexuality, early wounding, control, and emotional dysregulation seemed entangled, rage did not appear as simple anger. It appeared fused with bodily charge, intoxication, euphoria, release, and a strange kind of gratification. That is where TTORD came from. TTORD stands for Transverse Toxic Orgasmic Rage Disorder. Again, this is not an established clinical diagnosis. It is my own descriptive language for a pattern I observed and felt was not being named clearly enough elsewhere. Simple explanation: TTORD is when rage becomes fused with charge, release, and a kind of addictive or euphoric payoff. In this pattern, the person is not just angry, their body appears to be getting something from the rage itself. The anger becomes charged, it can look intoxicating, almost as if the person is feeding on the intensity, escalating into it or discharging through it. I do not mean that this is always sexual in the ordinary sense. I mean that the nervous system appears to have linked anger, power, release, arousal, and bodily payoff together. In my framework, TTORD can be understood as a specific form of spasmosis. The person has moved beyond clean emotional expression and into a rage-linked discharge state. Sometimes this appears unconscious, sometimes it appears semi-conscious, ritualized, or almost self-induced, as though rage itself has become a maladaptive release mechanism. So the hierarchy is simple. Spasmosis is the overarching principle of reactive override. TTGPD is the distorted polarity structure. TTORD is one possible extreme rage expression that can arise within that wider distortion. Part 3. How do these patterns show up in real life? They show up when someone cannot stay grounded in nuance, when identity becomes rigid, when relationships become role-played rather than lived, when control replaces truth, when external performance replaces authentic embodiment, when tenderness becomes less tolerable than friction, when a person appears more bonded to conflict, charge, righteousness, or power than to mutuality, softness, and clean presence. That is why I have had to name them. Because if we cannot name the pattern, it is much harder to see it. And if we cannot see it, we often normalize it. So the clean summary is this. Spasmosis is when reaction runs the person. TTGPD is when masculine and feminine polarity become distorted and performative. TTORD is when rage becomes fused with charge, release, and an intoxicating bodily payoff. And all three emerged because I saw a gap in language that I felt needed naming. That is the purpose of these terms. Not condemnation, not superiority, not false diagnosis, but clarity. To name a pattern, so the pattern can finally be seen. Thank you for listening. Published by the Nikeklarr Institute. Written and developed by Smith Nikeklarr Ahlaenovik, the Cartographer of Consciousness. Email contact@thenikeklarrinstitute.co.uk. Website thenikeklarrinstitute.co.uk. Facebook Nikeklarr Institute Community. TikTok @Nikeklarr_Institute. Instagram @Nikeklarr__Institute. Legal and publication framing note. Legal and publication framing note. For public use, the safest framing is to describe spasmosis, TTGPD, and TTORD as original conceptual, educational, and observational terms within Lee's body of work. They should not be described as established psychiatric, psychological, or medical diagnoses. Do not state or imply that these terms appear in recognized diagnostic manuals or established professional frameworks. Do not use them to claim that a named or identifiable person has a diagnosable condition. Avoid medical, therapeutic, or consumer-facing claims that suggest these concepts diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent illness. Keep the language in the realm of pattern recognition, philosophical inquiry, education, and personal use.